Okay, I want to talk about the TV show Vikings Valhalla. I finally got around to watching the first 2 minutes, especially. I'm going to comment on, and then the first 10 minutes or so of the show. So, spoiler alert: I'm going to let you know what happens in the first 10 minutes. If you've seen beyond the first episode, you've seen more than me. I'm going to try and make this quick because I'm running out of storage space. But basically, we have Vikings Valhalla. So it's set, for those of you who don't know, it's set in Kattegat, which Kattegat is actually a sea, or it's a body of water. It's not actually a city in real life. It's in between kind of Britain or it's in near Scandinavia. Um, but anyways, so we have Vikings Valhalla, and it's set in Kattegat, but it's also set mostly in the British Isles. So I think that's a little bit overkill because it's set in the same. They're basically copying Net or the History Channel. It's like more stuff in the British Isles because people apparently haven't had a original thought in like 10 years. Everyone's just doing Vikings, with the exception of the Norsemen or the Northmen or something like that. There was a movie that was done recently that was really good. I saw it in theaters and I loved it. But with the exception of that movie, which I highly recommend that movie, by the way, and I did another video about that, or I have another video about that. But this show, I wasn't expecting much, but it pleasantly surprised me in many ways. So first off, I'm going to praise it a little bit, and the costumes were pretty good. The architecture is at the very least plausible, if not fully pretty good. It doesn't have like a fort or a circle fort that we would have seen in Scandinavia, but it's definitely believable if nothing else. And it has like what I think would be like a longhouse or longhouses, and it's set in Scandinavia, but also most of the beginning of the show at least takes place in the British Isles. And then there's going to be revenge, right? Because so first off, it starts out almost like Game of Thrones style assassination. They wipe out all the Vikings in the area. And historically, in 2008, actually, was when we found out that that did happen. That massacre that they are mentioning and referring to, that did actually happen. So they wiped out a bunch of Vikings, and it was a revenge killing on behalf of the King Alfred II, and it blew up in his face because Alfred is also named Alfred the Ill-Advised. It's their version of Pearl Harbor, basically. You kill a bunch of Vikings, and the Vikings are not going to be happy about it. So yeah, it didn't work out the way he hoped it. He thought it would send a message, and it sent a message, but not the message he was hoping. So it really ticked off, actually, the king back in Denmark, I want to say. He got really upset, and he either came himself or he sent at least, like, probably 1,000 men. And this is when we get into, like, the Great Heathen Army and a bunch of stuff that I don't have time to fully dive into. But this is about the show Vikings. So their costumes, so their architecture, the buildings are at the very least plausible, if not pretty good. And then the costumes are pretty good. We see different colors, which color was expensive back then. If you have a colored outfit, that means that you can afford the dye, which was expensive. If you even know, like in the Bible, they talk about Joseph with a multicolored coat. That was expensive back in biblical times, but even like 1,000 years later, now we're into the Viking period, and it's still expensive to dye clothes because it's expensive and it takes a lot of manpower and labor to get colors and to get dye. So if you have colored outfits, which we do see here, it's a status symbol. And then yeah, so the area, it's like everyone wants to cover Britain. Even Netflix themselves, they already have the kingdom, so it's just like let's just throw more stuff in Britain. I don't know why everyone just wants to do Britain. They don't want to cover Russia, really. They don't really want to cover even the Vikings versus the Native Americans. That'd be super fascinating. I'd really like to see that. But they don't want to do that because they don't have original thoughts. This is set basically 100 years after the show Vikings, and then part of it is in Kattegat, which is not in Norway. It's a sea, it's a body of water, but it's this fictional city, right? So, but it's depicted pretty well in the show. And then the shields, credit to them, they're center grip shields, they're center bossed shields, so they're not held like this. You don't hold a Viking shield like this. You hold it like this. And we see this for the Vikings, and then also I'm just going to call them the English. I'm not going to sit and distinguish between the Mercia and Kingdom of Anglia and Sussex and Essex and all that. I'm just going to lump them together, which they weren't united either. We see this in the show Vikings, and then now in this show, I'm sure it's going to come up. But we also have Alfred II. So that kind of puts us into the time period that we're in. And just speaking a little bit, yeah, so overall, I'm pretty impressed with the costumes or the outfits, except for the armor. When it comes to the armor, we see this weird, like, leather again. It's more leather, which Vikings got that wrong too. They're like, we love leather. Let's just show all the Vikings in lots of leather and fur. Which fur, yes, because it's cold. So by all means, they would have fur, especially probably like over their coat, like we see in Game of Thrones, even, or like we see in this TV show Vikings. But so fur they would have had, but the daily wearing clothes are pretty good. But to show them all in this weird, it's like this weird pattern of it hurts my head to look at it. Okay, it's just gross. It's like a coat of plates. It's almost a coat of plates, which predates plate armor in the high medieval period. This is still in the early medieval period. It's in the Viking Age, if you want to call it that, which is a subcategory of the early medieval period. We're still in the early medieval people. We're in the Viking Age specifically, which is a more specific subset of the early medieval period, which is a period roughly to about the year 1000 and getting in a little bit after, which is show set after the year 1000. But it's still the early medieval period, pretty much. And so this is when all the Vikings are doing all the Viking things. And then so we see. So I'm gonna pick apart that armor. It's just not good, except for the shields. And then the Norman armor, or the not Norman. I'm sorry. The English armor. Again, I'm just gonna call it English. The English armor is actually pretty good, at least from what I see. It's dark and it's late at night, so it's hard to tell what's going on. But the armor looked pretty good. Then my next issue is with a female Jarl, because at that battle that I told you about in 2008, it was all males that were killed. And I think that's for a reason, because historically speaking, the Vikings did have shield maidens, but I think they're just superimposing the ideas of womanhood and masculinity of the modern age. They're just superimposing it on Vikings, which is not historical. And the TV show is not necessarily meant to be historical, but for those who don't know anything about the Viking period, they're just going to misuse and basically abuse the Viking period, which I'm okay with taking civil liberties, and I understand that sometimes that makes it more interesting. But at the same time, if you're just going to throw modern ideas on the past, then don't stay off the past. Make a show about something else. And then we get into the sea thing, which is where we see our first female Jarl, which is what she appears to be. I don't know if that's necessarily what she is, but it looks like it. She's the one calling the shots and leading the ship, which is not how we have no historical evidence, or even in the sagas, I don't think there's any evidence, unless correct me if I'm wrong, but definitely historically speaking, the sagas aren't necessarily history. They're just the best we have to go off of, so we use them to kind of understand the period. But as far as historical sources, we have the British accounts, which describe the atrocities of the Vikings, and then we have Ibn Fadlan is one of the best sources, ironically enough, and he's a Muslim. But he traveled to Scandinavia. So Muslims, by all means, or well, this is, yeah, I mean Muslims. This time there is Muslims. This is after Muslims have become a thing. So so Vikings or Muslims, I'm sorry, in the Viking place would have been completely plausible. In fact, Vikings even made it as far as Constantinople. They tried to raid Constantinople and they couldn't take down the walls, so they ended up getting hired on as the king's guard in Constantinople by the Byzantines. So yeah. And by the way, if you want to defeat Vikings, just build walls, and sooner or later that'll usually stop them, because Vikings don't have a lot of siege technology, because early on they didn't need it. They would just snatch and grab the monastery. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about slavery too. So slavery, we see two black slaves, which is pretty racist if you ask me. Why do they have to be black? Why are slaves always black? They're not, historically speaking, black. Slavery, I'm going to make another video about this, but slaves are not always black. Especially in the Viking period, especially by the Vikings themselves. They have monks that they can sell into slavery for the Norse and the Danes. For the Swedes went into Russia, and they basically founded a lot of Russia. If we look at I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. If we look at Sweden and then Russia, the Kievan Rus essentially founded Russia, but they had kind of become Russian by this point. And then we see the Normans, which are somewhat descendants of the Vikings as well, and then they're the ones who ended up conquering Britain after another Viking group attacked the British, or the English rather. Yeah, it wouldn't become Britain for a long time, because that's when we get Scotland united with the rest of the England. But anyways, that's what makes it British rather than English. And I'm just using English to throw all the Mercia and all that. I don't want to sit and separate them. So, anyways, yeah. So I take a little bit of an issue with that. And then, yeah, female Jarls, especially female black Jarls, there's no evidence. I don't even think that's plausible in the slightest. Like, I don't know how on earth they think that would ever happen. because the Scandinavian people, and they don't really have anyone with red beards, by the way, because we know just by the names of people that Vikings had a lot of blonde hair, but even a decent number of them probably had red hair too, or at least it was maybe a recessive gene for them, or some of them had red hair because we have people with names like so and so the red, or so and so fork beard, so and so the blonde, so and so the ugly, or whatever. Right? It's like a nickname. Or the boneless. The boneless, he has actually had a defect. That's why he's called that, and he had to be carried into battle. But he would still swing his sword with two other people carrying him into battle. Ivar the boneless. And he was a historical person. So yeah, so I just don't like them misappropriating culture. And by the way, you know what that says, by the way? That says that black people don't have enough interesting things to talk about on their own, which they do, and they have. I mean, look at Mansa Musa. He's a really rich guy who went on the Hajj, which is an Islamic. It's the pilgrimage to Mecca. That's why they're called sometimes Hajis. They're referred to as that. It's not a slang. It's not a hateful term. It just means they're people who go on the Hajj. Because white people, they don't know that much about Muslim people, so they just call them Hajis. And so, or Muslims, or Middle Eastern, or Arab people, which those are all slightly different terms. But yeah, so I think they should have maybe thrown in a few Muslim or Arabic type of people in there rather than African, because I think it's a bit of a reach to say that they pulled slaves up and then they sold slaves from Africa to the Vikings. I mean, sure, they were reaching far afield in their trade, but oftentimes Vikings were going to these other places to trade. I mean, especially in Russia, they had ships that they would take across rivers, and then they would dismount and cross the part where there is no river, and they would drag it by land with stumps and roll it across the land, and then reach another river or lake, and then eventually they would trade with like Constantinople and places like that. So I just I don't know why they have to have two black slaves and an Asian. It's like, are we just trying to hit the inclusivity button? Is this just like diversity and inclusion? Is that just what this is, or like it's not really plausible? I don't think, especially an Asian. I mean, I would say a Muslim would be, or a Middle Eastern person would be a lot more plausible, even in a fictitious or real Viking city like Oslo, or any Viking city at the time that was prominent. Copenhagen. I mean, these are cities that are still prominent to this day in the Scandinavian or Nordic world. So I don't know why they didn't just do that, or use a real place name. They had to make up a fake place name based off of body of water, but whatever. That's cool. And then getting into the body of water, so we see these people that are about to drown, and that did by all means happen. I mean, even once you know where Greenland is or Iceland, there's no guarantee that they're going to make it back, and they kind of reference that in the show, which was pretty cool. Because they're like, wow, you made it across that ocean for 5 days in that ship, or boat, or it was a ship, but it's a really small ship. It's almost a boat. So yeah, they're at least referencing that, which is cool, because some of the Vikings wouldn't have made it back, and I actually learned about this in a history of science and technology of all courses, not in a medieval history course. So yeah, not all the Viking ships made it back to their destination, or even made it to any destination. A bunch of them probably sank. Now, it's hard to tell that as historians and say, oh, for sure this vessel sank, but sometimes we have little hints that they might not have came back, and they might not have made it anywhere. Of course, it's really hard to track that, especially when you're talking about the Vikings, who don't have a lot of written record. They have the sagas, which are after the fact, and then they do have runes, so they have some writing, but they don't have a lot of writing, especially during the Viking period. It's mostly other people writing about them. But anyway, yeah, we do have archaeological words evidence, yeah, about that raid, and then we have historical evidence too, which is predates. We've known about the historical texts. We just didn't know if it was real, and we didn't have any archaeological sites or archaeological evidence to back it until now. We do, and when we see that too, we see that all the raiders are male. So if that's anything to go off of, there's a reason that all the raiders are male. And even in the modern day, like, we can say that women can do everything men can do, and that's great, except for they can't. I mean, there's a reason that men and women have separate sports. So when it comes into the military, even to this day, I would argue that at least in combat roles, especially in special forces, I don't even want to know how far they're washing down the standards, but like in the military, especially for infantry guys, I mean, they probably have to water down the standards, because I was pretty fit, and I struggled to get to get the machine gun over my head and to pass some of the tests, right? So, I mean, are they just watering down the standards, or are they actually holding them to the same standards? I don't know, but back to the Vikings. Yeah, the Vikings had shield maidens, which I can unpack at a later date if you want me to. But I want to actually look into that a little more too and do a little more historical research, actual historical research based off the primary sources that we do have. But in any case, the Vikings, the most of the people fighting in Viking society were men, and not only that, you could divorce. So the Vikings did have divorce, and they did have a lot of rights for women at the time. So, for example, the right to divorce was a big deal, and so a woman could divorce a man for not being manly enough, and to include showing his chest, which I think that's very manly, especially if he's if he's got a nice muscles to show off. But if he's exposing his chest, it was viewed as feminine, kind of like showing his, I guess, like maybe he's showing his boobs or something. if uh, I don't know why that was seen as not manly, because I mean, even today you got like Henleys and you got things that kind of show off the chest. You got V-necks, you got button downs that kind of show off your chest. If especially if you got big muscles, it's like, oh yeah, look at me, I have a big chest. But anyway, yeah, so you could divorce your husband for showing showing his chest. I don't know if that actually happened, um, but yeah, you could divorce your husband and your wife for not being either being too feminine or too masculine, whichever way they were. Like if you're a woman and you're too acting too masculine, you can divorce them for that. But if you're a man and you're acting too much like a woman, you can divorce them for that. And not only can you divorce them for that, but they're probably not going to make it to Valhalla if they're not being brave. In fact, even for facing the Blood Eagle, they're not allowed to make noise. And the Blood Eagle wasn't something that they did to their enemies. It's something that they did to their own people if they like betrayed you. So if you betray some Jarl, which was the chieftain that was in charge of the area, because it's not a united kingdom, as I said, if you betray some Jarl, he might be really upset, and rather than just lobbing off your head with a sword, which he can afford because he's rich, he might really want to torture you. And so he might give you the Blood Eagle, which is the Blood Eagle. You pull back your arms, and you pull out the rib cage, and you, while they're alive, by the way, and you pull it back until it flutters like an eagle. So I'm not sure why I'm laughing at that, but yeah, if you betray someone in the Viking society, it's might not go well for you. And if you make any noise, you don't make it to Valhalla. So you better be quiet while you're having your ribs bent and beat backwards like a birdie. Just be quiet, and then you'll go to Valhalla. It'll be fine. It'll all be over soon. But yeah, so there's that. And then I'm running out of time. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this video to be so long, but yeah, we have that, and then we have like a black female Jarl, which I'm just gonna go ahead and call the cultural appropriation card, which I don't really care, by the way. If you're black or you're Asian or whatever and you want to be a Viking, then go for it. But I'm actually like 50% Scandinavian, so like theoretically, back in the day, we would have been doing something, farming or lobbing off people's heads and going to monasteries and doing something. You know, Norwegian and Danish, so not Swedish, so we wouldn't have been in Russia. But to show the slaves as black, by the way, why do the slaves have to be black? I think it's a lot more likely that they would have been Russian. They would have looked white, people. You don't have to be black to be a slave, okay? In fact, most slaves were white. White people had a lot of white slaves, and even the Muslims had white slaves for various reasons. They also had black slaves too. The Ottomans had black slaves for, you know, doing the dishes and stuff like that, but then they had white slaves in the harem, so they're sleeping with the white girls and the Muslim girls in their harem, but the black girls not so much. That's just historical fact, okay? And then so the Muslim world, the Roman world had gladiators, so there is a reason that the gladiators and Spartacus rebelled, because they were already dead men and basically anyway, so why not rebel and try and fight them? And in the Viking period, the Vikings had slaves. You know who? A lot of them came from Sweden. Well, the Swedes would go into Russia, they formed the Kievan Rus, and then they would just pick up a few Slavic peoples, some children or something, that, hey, you look like a good slave, sneak up behind you or run you down on a horse, if Vikings didn't have that many horses, but some of them probably did, or point a bow and arrow at you and say, hey, I'm tying you up and you're my slave now. It's as simple as that. In fact, the term Slavic people, or Slav, it comes from the word slave. So Slavic people are slaves, historically speaking, to the Vikings, among other people, and also and then later to the Ottomans. But yeah, Slavic people, it means slave. I'm sorry. Not sorry. Okay, so moving on. And then yeah, we have like someone from Asia and a couple black people, which is fine. They have black slaves, and then I covered that already. And then female jarls, I don't think that's really a thing. But yeah, I'm gonna say cultural appropriation because they want to throw white people, specifically Norwegian history. They just want to abuse it and torture it and completely malign it to the point where it's not even really Viking. It's Vikings, and I already told you that the term Viking isn't even the best term to describe the Norse people at the time. But even if we're gonna use the term Viking people and we're gonna go that route, um, and they're not a unified people totally either, but which we talked about. But I just have a problem with, and I don't even mind cultural appropriation per se. Like, if you want to be a Viking, then be a Viking. If you want to be a historical reenactor, doing longsword stuff or doing HEMA stuff, nowadays anyone can play with. I don't want to say play with swords, but you can learn how to use a longsword. If you're a guy, if you're a girl, it doesn't matter these days. But historically speaking, it mattered quite a lot because it was the men, and specifically the nobles, for most of the medieval period. Although in this early medieval period, it's any men that are like they just want to get some gold, and so they'll go on a raid and get some gold. And then by this point, they've already settled, so they've already had ties. And then Alfred the Ill-Advised decided to attack them and provoke the wrath of the Vikings. So overall, I think that the TV show did a really good job, but at the same time, there's several things that are not great about the show. So, but I was expecting it. Excuse me. I was expecting it to be a lot worse. So I'm pleasantly surprised, but at the same time, there's a few things that they could have done better with the armor and with the not having so many female jarls, especially if they're black. Because really it's insulting to black people because you're just saying that they don't have anything worth talking about. Like, they're not going to talk about Mansa Musa. They're not going to talk about, any of these, their legends. They're not going to talk about, maybe they'll talk about the Zulus because people kind of like the Zulus and they kind of know who the Zulus are. Or they maybe, if you're really lucky, they might hint, and Netflix, you feel free to use this, by the way. They might talk about the Nubians, which, by the way, I saw this documentary about Nubians and how the Nubians were ancient Egyptian, which they had no evidence. They just it was complete conjecture. It wasn't even a documentary. They just asserted that, hey, ancient Egyptians were black, and no, they were not black. They had contact with the Nubians. The Nubians, they used them in their army because the Nubians were really good archers, but they didn't. They ruled over them, but the pharaohs. They suggested that the pharaohs were those guys, and the pharaohs were not. They weren't black people that were pharaohs as far as we can tell, or as far as we know. Unless I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, then by all means correct me. But just look at the Egyptian art, and you will clearly see. And look for that matter, look at Viking art, or look at English art that depicts the Viking period. They're all mostly white-skinned people. Now the merchants by all means, they were probably merchants from the Middle East in the various cities. But when it comes to like female jarls, they would have definitely been Scandinavian, and they probably wouldn't have been female. We have no evidence of that historically. So stop trying to superimpose modern ideas on the past, please, by all means. And yeah, I don't really care about cultural appropriation, but just most people don't know any better. So that's when they see this show, they're gonna think that it's like history, or they're gonna think that's what the Viking Age looked like. So just have to be careful how you depict things. Otherwise, people that don't know any better, that aren't like myself, that aren't history buffs, they're gonna think that that's 100% what it was like. So they're gonna think that Vikings really ran around in like these weird coats of leather and weird leather pattern armor, when really they had chainmail. Okay, thank you for your time. Bye.